Well, good morning, Brad Reynolds.
Hi there, Ed. How are you?
I'm very well. This is Ed Reeser on B Zone with Brad Reynolds, our second interview on your wonderful book we spoke about a month ago. Yeah.
Yep.
And God's Great Tradition of Global Wisdom, Guru Yoga-Satsang on the Integral Age, an appreciation of Avatar Adi Da Samraj, and illuminating the great tradition of humankind.
Sounds good. I think I'll buy a copy.
Well, I have to tell you, it's an encyclopedia to me. It's a reference book. It's just filled with so much, packed, I should say, not filled, packed with so much, because you put, I can't, it's just unbelievable what you put into this book.
Well, thank you very much. Because it does have a chapter addressing all the major world religions, so that's kind of what made it a little bulky. But you do get a brief tour through all the world's major religions and how important a guru adept was in each of those religions.
Well, let me just tell you that since I go to Harvard University once a week and I go into the Widener Library, not to mention anything about what's in the Theological Seminary Library, but just in the Widener Library.
Wow.
There are, what you have in this book has, I say, about 2 floors of probably 50,000 square feet of books all about what you put into this one
book.
I've
compressed them all into.
Well, no, that's really that's why I say it's packed. You know?
Well, that's part of the point is I'm trying not just to be a scholar and approach it here, but I do approach the book as a spiritual practitioner. So I'm trying to encourage people to engage in spiritual practice, not just learn facts and data.
Well, I appreciate that. And that's why I wanted to grab you, because you're a wealth of information. And I have been asked by many people for clarification on many of these items that you have in your book. And you have a short bit, a chapter on, in chapter 1 that really covers so much of what people ask me about. And you have a subtitle in chapter 1, which is called The Advantages in Understanding God's Great Tradition. And you have a number of bullet points. And for those who don't have the book, I thought maybe I would really, really appreciate if we could just go over some of your bullet points that you have on this subtitle of The Advantages in Understanding God's Great Tradition.
Well, that's a really good idea. In fact, it links up with the recent video that I have posted on my YouTube channel, God's Great Tradition. In fact, if you wouldn't mind, I would like to run the first couple minutes of that video now, which kind of introduces the main thesis behind the advantages in studying the Great Tradition.
Okay, so for our, yeah, no, very much.
The Great Tradition is Avatar Adi Da's phrase for indicating, in his words, quote, the common wisdom inheritance of humankind, unquote. The whole point of studying what I call God's great tradition of global wisdom is not simply about becoming studious scholars of different cultural texts or traditional views, but to be motivated to do ego-transcending spiritual practices, sadhana, and to engage in real satsang with a genuine adept guru. As Ken Wilber once succinctly announced, quote, the only major purpose of a book on mysticism should be to persuade the reader to engage in mystical practice, unquote. We must realize for ourselves what our wisest ancestors have also realized. There is God only, only God. We must discover our innate Buddha nature by whatever name, the divine reality that is always already the case, alive and present as radiant, transcendental, conscious light, as Adi Da says. Therefore, we are all called, as the human race, to thoroughly study and listen to the sacred voices and spiritual confessions in this great tradition of humankind, which is why Adi Da implores his devotees and everyone to, quote, go to school with the great tradition, unquote, in order to serve our spiritual growth.
So maybe if I could just start with the first bullet point. He said the great tradition appreciates the development of all traditions and tribes. Let me just stop there.
Well, tribes is a name that Adi Da kind of uses to describe particular cultural worldviews. So all the different nation states can be considered a tribe or an ethnic group, that type of thing. And the great tradition wants to include all of those. That is one of the great things about it. One of the unique things about the whole concept of the great tradition of global wisdom is the fact that all these religions and institutions and traditions of the past never really recognized that they were one great global tradition. They were all very centered into their own particular time frame and cultural reference. It's really only been within the last 100 years or so that the whole concept and idea of a global tradition has even been made possible. I mean, you know, maybe going back to the 1893 World Parliament of World Religions was the first time that all the religions actually had conversations with themselves. There have been small minor pockets like Alexandria and in Baghdad, the great school of wisdom, where different teachers would come together and converse.
But that was, as you were saying, it was a very, you had to go physically, you had to
That's
go
right.
to Alexandria, you had to
That's
go
right.
to Nalanda, you had to go to these places here. And I think the reference in technology terms is that the technology has broken down the barriers of distance. So with the telegraph to the radio to the television to now computer, you can be, and you can cause an Arab Spring in Tunisia just by doing something on an internet. The barriers have broken down.
Yes, that's right. And with worldwide travel, you know, people have come to know each other a lot better. And, you know, there's definitely a large movement of appreciating all the world cultures too. But at the same time, that kind of creates a hodgepodge of, well, who's really true? What's really right? What's going on? And this is one of the reasons why I focus on the fact that the guru adepts, the ones who actually are the authors of the world's religions and the sacred scriptures, are the best source for figuring that out. And that's been one of the advantages of having somebody like Adi Da be born into the late 20th century. And he had access to all that material, even though his enlightenment itself was not based upon him studying all the world religions. But after he began teaching, he emphasized the fact that we do have access to all of these religions and sacred scriptures, what I call in chapter 2, the divine library. And he wanted all of us to read a spectrum of the world's sacred teachings because that would inform us of the sacred process itself. the process that does lead to God realization and enlightenment. And once you have developed a culture of tolerance and you realize that each of the different world religions has its own particular value and worldview, you can also see how it tends to express a certain stage of life, a certain point in the developmental process, going from yogic to saintly to sagely means basically, traversing the gross, the subtle, and the causal realms until the non-dual realization. And that was another advantage that Ken Wilber's spectrum of consciousness model gave us as well. So Adi Da's 7 stages of life model becomes a tool to help us understand the great global tradition and where each of the religions are tending to focus themselves. But once a person understands that, they kind of get pulled out of the provincial religious upbringing that they've had ever since they were a child, since we all tend to be born into a particular religious point of view, right? And that can limit us. If you're born Christian and all you've ever heard about is Jesus and the tenets of the Christian faith, you're going to have difficulty understanding what a Hindu or a Buddhist is really interested in. And the whole point of the advantage of studying the world's great tradition is that you can develop a sympathy for the other religions, as well as better understanding your born religion, which is, something the world needs now to develop a culture of tolerance, as Adi Da would say.
Yeah, so, since we're so fragmented today in all aspects of politics, or not just religion, but everything else, everybody, although these tribes are now magnifying themselves to global levels, it just creates more division and less unity. I wanted to go over some of the other points because we have a limited time and you have a number. I'm flipping the pages, 2 full pages, 3 full pages here. So maybe let me just go over here. The great tradition sees human history as a global history. Human history as a global history of one human race.
Right.
Thus, it is our global inheritance, or common wisdom inheritance, as a born human being. So
that's right.
The inheritance.
Well, for one, we are one human race, and we have been on a global diaspora ever since we left Africa. 100,000 years ago, or even prior to that, right? And the different races, the different skin colors, all developed because people had traveled to different regions and evolved and adapted to the environmental niche that they were living in. But still, had the same structure, the same brain, the same anatomy, and also importantly the same esoteric structure, which means that the Kundalini currents and the process of awakening the inner mind and the heart are all the same. And we all know that. If you ever meet somebody from another country, you realize that we're just the same people, with the same needs and desires. And so the fact that science has also proven through DNA studies that we are one human race. And that needs to be acknowledged now, whereas most of our human history has been, oh, that's the other guy over there. And, the other tribes, the other nations, the other civilizations even fighting one another for dominance. And this is what realizing that everything, all the cultures are our inherited legacy, we can become more aware and tolerant of the world situation altogether. And that therefore needs to influence our politicians and the way we conduct business. That's why, for example, I've always believed that the United Nations was a good step in that direction, because it rose out of the fact that we had had a Second World War in the 20th century, the most devastating war ever. And the nations realized that we needed a forum to be able to talk and cooperate. And of course, you know, it has its limitations without a doubt, because certain wealthier nations tend to dominate the process. But nonetheless, it's a forum that needs to be addressed. And so
I agree with you, because as that League of the United Nations, which came out of the League of Nations, goes back to World War I and Woodrow Wilson, who's formulated that plan, because he saw
that
that
the United Nations didn't, I mean, the United States did not join the League of Nations.
Right.
Which is what made it somewhat impotent, right? That's why the United Nations was, you know, a step in the right direction, because everybody participated. And also Eleanor Roosevelt helped create the International Declaration of Human Rights, which is another way of trying to, you know, protect the human rights of all human beings. And one of those rights that I do mention in my book, in Article 26, is the right to be educated, to have free access to education and the educational tools that a person needs to develop global awareness, and the fact that they each of us, every single person, has a right to the wealth of wisdom that we have been given by our ancestors.
I think this is key what you're bringing, because when I go over this, and we will go over it, because you really, one individual has to really go through a process here to it's just so necessary to codify this, to structurally put this in place first, because really this requires one, a true sense of unity, a true sense of heart opening, a true sense of psychological transformation. This is not just like, I'm going to give you the 10 Commandments here and you can follow it, or the Torah, and you've got the book of knowledge now, or like here. No, this is a real samyama that you're bringing up to the conversation here.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not just suggesting a political peace settlement, but actually to engage in spiritual practice so that the full development of the entire human being can take place. And that's what we need to be able to offer all of our children and all beings. And this is where, obviously, the importance of the adept or the guru, the wise master, who has always gone through the process, him or herself, right? They have had to take the time to develop the potential to ever go out and teach, because you have to have a teacher who is authentic, who knows what they're talking about. Just like in science, you have to have a real professor and somebody that has been annealed by the knowledge that they need to know to master their profession. And same with spiritual discourse.
Well, what we were just speaking about here is the great tradition, and this is another one of your bullet points. The great tradition transcends religious provincialism, thus generating cultural and religious tolerance to provide the foundations for the global culture and spiritual understanding. So this religious provincialism is exactly what you're speaking about, right?
Yes, and not only that, and as the next bullet point will point out, scientific materialism is the other thing that's studying the great tradition. So studying our global inheritance of wisdom will help a person loosen up their attachment to their particular religious tradition while still maintaining sympathy for it. It's not like you reject what you were brought up to believe in and whatnot. And in the same with science, because obviously in our secular culture, you know, most of our schools tend to indoctrinate us into the scientific worldview, which tends to dispense with God altogether. And so that also is a limited worldview. Whereas if you study the whole tradition of humanity, you will be able to embrace science as well as spirituality. And that's one of the great gifts of the integral vision as well.
Yeah, no, I think what you're pointing to is so important, because if you are listening closely, and I want to just address the scientific materialism, it has really usurped God and religion. Now religion, from my understanding, science has now become a religion. And so the authority, so when you hear people speaking and newscasters announcing, they will always say, scientists say, and they always like, oh, okay, then therefore this must be true because science says it.
Well, the great gift of science is that it's peer reviewed. And so it tries to be more objective in its data points, whereas religion tends to be very subjective. So that is one of the great advantages of science, is it's not just somebody's opinion.
No, it's mathematically probability and possibilities. It's all about possibilities and trying to narrow down possibilities. So I don't want to get locked into it, because that's one of my little things, but I do want to say study and embody the great tradition in today's modern world integrates Eastern Enlightenment mysticism with Western Enlightenment science and democracy.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So because, you know, this is one of the things of seeing human history as a developmental process as well. And this is a big part of what Ken Wilber's integral work focuses on too, which is why so many people find a lot of sympathy with it. Science has developed a point of view that is very useful and that corrects some of the superstitions and mythic beliefs of the world religions that have created dysfunction in our society. And yet, at the same time, it's incomplete, which is why we have to be able to transcend and include science and develop our higher potentials. And our human body, as an esoteric anatomy, has all of those functions available for us. In fact, the discriminative mind, discriminative intelligence, is one of the important capacities that Adi Da really focuses on. Because if you don't understand what the true purpose of religion is, which is enlightenment and God realization and knowing that the universe is a spiritual reality, you won't be able to develop the capacity to see that yourself, right? Because you will be in the consensus trance of our cultural mindset, because you won't find this information on the TV.
No, but you really have to be, I mean, as I hear you, but you know, you really have to include, when you say the inclusive part, that the believers have to be included in. So when you're saying God realization as the function of religion, I don't know if my friends down here at the local Unitarian, or I wouldn't even go that high up in the Christian ladder, let's say some of my friends in the Baptist church, I don't think they see the things as you do or I do in terms of these higher levels. I mean,
well, that's why I didn't say it was the function of religion. I said it's the function of true spirituality. And there's a difference. That's why that phrase, spiritual but not religious, is very popular now. What, 30 or 40% of the population claims that's their worldview. So well, they realize
maybe
that.
Could you just make it, please, at this point, make it, clarify that point between religion and spirituality.
So the developmental path of human consciousness tends to grow through pre-personal to personal or egoic stages to transpersonal. So
okay, so stop there, because I'm not familiar. When you go transpersonal, what do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is when a young child, for the growth for the first two stages of life, a child is developing its own self-identity and becoming aware of who he or she is, right? So by the third stage, you're using the mind and you really have developed, you're a teenager now, you really got a good sense or exploring who am I? What am I interested in doing with my life? This type of thing, right? So by the time a person is in adulthood, they should have developed a stable ego. Okay, so we're talking, by the time a person turns 21 years of
Right.
age,
Right.
you have a pretty good identity of who you are and what you want to do.
Right.
If
Yeah.
your developmental process has gone healthily. And that's when
Right.
you
Right.
start to look beyond even your own personal opinions, which is transpersonal. And you start to investigate the religions and what is the real meaning of life and what is the purpose of me being here and what is the universe really about. And these type of more advanced contemplative modes that will lead a person into yogic investigations is kind of the chore or the task of the developing adult. And this is who and why I'm suggesting, and people like Adi Da and other spiritual teachers suggest, you need to begin, or not begin, but to further your study by reading the sacred text, the divine library of humankind.
Because we do have time, and I do want to get into this, but I want to go through some of your more bullet points. So
all right,
this is why your book is so powerful, and it requires a semester down here at Harvard. Okay.
And I have a lot of charts to help out too.
So the great tradition counters the egoic tendencies toward religious or mythical cultism by transcending the errors and liabilities of the earlier stages of life.
There you go.
So maybe you could unpack that one.
Well, that's basically addressing what you were just asking about. It allows the transpersonal and the more evolved spiritual stages of awareness to start to unfold. And then that releases our identity and fixation on our group, whether it's an ethnic group, whether it's a national group, whether it's a racial group or a religious group, right?
Or a sexual group.
Or what, yeah, right, or a gender identity, whatever it is. And it allows the awareness of the mind and the heart to expand, to be able to acknowledge them and include them, but not be so closely identified with them that it will create dysfunction and dilemma or even wars with people that don't think like you do. That
right.
Type
And
of thing.
What you're addressing, it seems to me that most of the world, at least if I'm reading anything more than my local newspaper, the world seems to be in these, if you will, earlier developmental stages.
That's right. That's right. In fact, a lot of psychologists and philosophers have commented that our world currently is like an adolescent. Everybody's kind of wanting to fight for their own identity and, I'm the toughest guy on the block and all this type of thing. Whereas the earlier stages, that you were blindly following a particular religion with a great daddy in the sky are almost comparable to childish stages of development.
Right.
And so that is the big challenge now, is as a world society, we are trying to extend beyond adolescent egoic patterns of independence and create a more cooperative attitude that a more mature adult should be able to do, which is why spiritual practices can be so useful, because they help create a state of equanimity in the adult, and you can then cooperate and be more tolerant of other people.
So because this is so impacted here, I want to unpack a little bit, because what you're referring to, and I'm going to filter it through me, is this is where Wilber becomes so powerful in the world of psychology, because most of my understanding, most of psychology is working out your transitional issues, really, within these kinds of confinements, within these structures, within the family,
within the earlier stages.
Within the earlier stages. And you're saying that you really, I mean, you're transforming a whole psychoanalytical model of the way the world operates, at least in the traditional sense, still operating on these university campuses today.
Oh, yes, absolutely. That's exactly right. And that's why Wilber was outside of the traditional institutions of psychology when he suggested that we take the stages of developmental psychology and Freudian, Jungian, and, you know, even humanistic psychology as representing the earlier stages of life. But then in the 1960s, transpersonal psychology began to emerge. That found a
Is
great...
that the Carl Rogers and the...
Abraham Maslow,
yeah, okay,
and right. Stan Grof, these
right.
type of individuals, you know, somewhat based upon psychotropic or psychedelic substances, but also by understanding what the advantages of meditation were, right?
Right.
And so what Wilber did was took the developmental psychology, added the transpersonal psychology, and that gave a more full picture of the possibilities of human growth. And wow. That is where so that is the cutting edge. We're on the cutting edge of that process right now.
I'm really getting a sense of what we're talking about as if I were in William Jennings Bryan's world and Picasso came in, or I was with Homer's world and I was painting European landscapes, and all of a sudden Picasso comes from Paris and gives me a Cubist art rendition of my landscape. We're speaking as much as a transformation,
yeah, that's right,
as traditional landscape art to Cubism and
right. Well, that's it. It's not. It's a development of worldviews, is the process that happens not only for the individual, but for the collective, and that's what Wilber's 4 quadrants, for example, was trying to help outline. That there's interiors and exteriors of both individuals and collective societies. And what we want to be able to do to be integral is to be able to acknowledge all of these different domains of human awareness and make sure that we're including them all, as opposed to just, you know, being blind to that developmental process. And so we need maps. And so, you know, the 7 stages of life that Adi Da proposes, or the spectrum of consciousness that Ken Wilber proposes, or the dynamic stages that spiral dynamics propose, and other developmental models give us a map to better understanding not only where we are now, but where we can go in the future.
So, I mean, really, I mean, what you've just spiral, I mean, what you just said, I need to raise my hand and get a class on this. So, so this is where I would like to stay with you in this conversation more than this little bit of time we have here. But let's
do it again.
No, I absolutely do. Now I'm flipping the page. It's still going to take us 3 hours, but I don't have 3 hours to have with you right now. But I want to, you know, somehow continue this in an overarching way. So if you could kind of overarch in a short moment here for our audience to continue on. I don't want to go item by item, but if you could give an overarching view, and we can come back at another time to speak about these advantages.
Well, for one, let me say that I do summarize a lot of these advantages in the video that we saw a little
Oh,
earlier.
okay.
If you watch the entire 15-minute video, I will discuss all these. But the overarching view is the whole purpose of studying the great tradition of global wisdom isn't just to become a master or a scholar in all these different sacred texts, or to, become, multicultural and understanding and appreciating all the cultures. It's also to help encourage people to engage in real ego transcending spiritual practice. I think Wilbur said once, quote, "The only major purpose of a book on mysticism isn't to encourage the reader to engage in mystical practice," unquote, right? And Adi Da said something similar. All the holy books are our books. So go to school and be transformed in your mind by the great tradition of humankind. And the
So
whole
your
point
book,
is to inspire people to practice, take up sadhana, establish a relationship with a bona fide and authentic spiritual master, and continue to grow and evolve into becoming a more loving and tolerant human being.
so not just this little chapter, your book is really calling for a complete new understanding and tolerance, but really, really understanding of not only your own tradition and the cultural limitations, like
Right.
language would be a limitation. I mean, I was just doing an interview with somebody that there is no word for guru in the English language. I have to go to another culture to even talk about a concept or a function of a guru, which is not even in my language. So you're saying I have to bridge. Not only I have to understand my limitation, but I have to bridge into another.
Exactly. This is the process that the world is already going through now. East has met West, and each is serving one another. The West is bringing, more practical, physical possibilities to the East, and the East is bringing higher spiritual possibilities to the West. But the whole point is we are one human being, one human race. And so all those potentials are really embedded in everybody and ultimately in every culture. And so my book is just supporting the movement, this so-called New Age movement, or what I call the integral age, that has been emerging in force, or, step by step, little by little, since the 60s. And that type of thing. So there's a lot of other thinkers that are going in the same direction.
Well, yeah. Well, as you're speaking and what you're saying, because I've just done an enormous amount of study with Vivekananda,
Right.
And the reason why he came to the World Parliament of Religions in 1893 was exactly what you're saying. He says he was bringing the East, the wisdom here, because he wanted to bring the wealth, knowledge, and quality of life that we have in the West to the East. So he was saying the same thing 150 years ago.
Well, he's definitely a big inspiration for me. In fact, notice he was a trained lawyer. He spoke really good English. So he embodied in his own being the union of the East and the West, which is part of the reason he was so effective in bringing his message to the Western world.
Well, I was just reading, and I have been studying Vivekananda's newspaper articles, not only in the Western newspapers, but in India. His ability to translate these concepts that were in the East and these ancient traditions to the Western mind was absolutely exquisite.
Absolutely.
And they were getting it.
That's right. And he met with a lot of important people too, like Tesla. He met with Tesla, and You know, Tesla, of course, was very interested in electricity, and so the etheric and the Akashic field were of great interest to him. And yeah, Vivekananda was a real brilliant mind that helped bridge that gap. And of course, he died before he was
39
40?
years old.
Yeah.
39.
And so he also was very frustrated by the inability of that gap to be bridged, because as well as he was accepted and revered by many of the intellectuals of the West, he was also condemned as being a black or brown-skinned man, and the
Oh, he was the
newspapers really attacked him very much too. So the prejudice of the West was very evident to him as well.
He was the devil. He was the, I mean, I have
Well,
articles.
some of those news, right?
He was
And you know, there were sexual scandals and the whole 9 yards. They usually get placed on gurus. In fact, you know, maybe we could end with the fact that this is possibly one of the reasons Adi Da had to emerge as a Westerner, as a white guy who actually embodies the wisdom of the West, but he was born, I mean, the wisdom of the East, but he was born in the West. So he's the first avatar, great spiritual master to appear in the West, to have mastered the Eastern system. And that is also an advantage to all of us, and will be into the future as well, which is one of the reasons I like to and prefer to highlight him throughout my book, because he has such a summary and worldwide vision of this entire process. And yet at the same time, he's always teaching and grounding everything in the realization of the divine presence for every single human being. It's not a matter of East and West. It's a matter of realizing the unity of the divine oneness of spirit itself. So,
well, that's clearly and I don't think anybody can deny it today, that we have to recognize that not only do we live in a global economy, because that's as far as most people can understand the globe,
yeah, right.
but we live in a global interacted biological and every other, you know, segment of thinking that the academics can divide the world into all these different categories. We live in one world, and it's becoming more and more apparent that, you know, what you do in California affects me in Massachusetts. What I do in Massachusetts affects everything else that's going on. We're all interrelated, and the tentacles that are now are magnifying so much. We better get on the same ship here, or we're in deep poo-poo.
Yeah, that's right, because we're absolutely one with the natural environment too. And so if we don't honor our unity with the with nature itself, we're in big trouble. And of course, the underlying prior unity of all the diversity of the manifested forms of the universe is spirit itself, is the divine condition. We don't just live in a world, we live in a spiritual universe that extends from the Big Bang to, you know, all reaches of the manifest cosmos. And by understanding and discovering the spiritual nature of our own existence and the existence of all things, we can see that there's a fundamental prior unity that brings us all together. Already, we're always already involved in this unity. So,
well, we just covered 1/2 of one page of your book that talks about God's great tradition of global wisdom. And I want to just say that I will put that little video of yours, which I believe is only a couple of minutes. I don't know how long it is.
yep, a couple minutes.
I'll insert this at the end of our talk. And I would like to invite you back again to speak more about your book. I'm just blown away with what you've done here. And I think more and more people really, this is so important today that people need to get out of their little cubby holes, come out into the world and understand that Jesus and Muhammad and Adi Da and
Ramana
whoever.
Maharshi and Vivekananda and Ramana yeah, it's just, yeah.
Right.
And, we can all be happy and, celebrate the great possibilities for the future as long as we can grow beyond our divisions.
Well, I want to thank you very, very much for your
Thank you,
time,
brother.
and I'm sorry to cut this short, but I do have a schedule I have to keep today. So I just glad to catch you, and
All right, my man.
I look forward to
Sounds
speaking
good.
to you
And
again
thanks
soon.
everybody for listening. I highly appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy reading the book.
Okay. So
All right.
again, until the next time, peace and love to you.
See ya.